quite a significant rats in the sack factor here. I think Prigozhin made it very clear the depth of his animus against Shoigu, against the Russian chief of staff Gerasimov. And he made it clear that to some extent this was a personal attack on them. In the statements that he was making while he was still being careful not to mention Putin by name, his main focus, Prigozhin's main focus, appears to have been on Shoigu and Gerasimov, and on a pitch to say these guys have got to go because they're making a mess of the war. And in that sense, it was a bit of a power play on his part.
An astounding 48 hours in Russia, with the boss of the Wagner private army going into exile in Belarus after calling off his rebellion and marched towards the Kremlin, saying he wanted to avoid bloodshed.
Simon Smith is a former UK ambassador to Ukraine who also served as a diplomat in both Kyiv and Moscow. We caught up with him ahead of the programme.
I think it's been a very bad day for Putin. He's seen his authority challenged. He's seen some of his narratives about the war in Ukraine challenged. And I think most of all, he's had to make this extraordinary climb down. He was on the TV addressing the nation earlier in the day and using very forceful language, talking about inevitable punishments that the instigators of this, what he called a mutiny, would suffer. And then a few hours later, it had all been sorted, not by him, by his not so very great mate, President Lukashenko of Belarus. And the guys leading the mutiny are on their way to Belarus, we're being told, and are about to escape the inescapable punishment that Putin announced. So not a great day from the point of view of Putin's message to Russia's people that he's in charge, that he knows what he's doing. And I think crucially, the part of the message that has been really degraded by Prigozhin's actions and statements is what he has said about the reason why Russia started its war on Ukraine. And Prigozhin challenged even that, saying basically this was a false premise on which Russia started the war in Ukraine. That Russia was not under attack, that it had no need to defend itself, and so on. Now, a lot of Russian people will not notice that. They won't hear those words, but a lot will. And although this is a setback for Putin, I don't think it's a catastrophe for him just yet. I think his authority is seriously weakened, and I think he has some pretty serious questions to address in the days ahead.
And where do you think it leaves Russia's war effort? Because the Wagner Group, we understand, were pretty important to their fighting edge. Are they still going to be there? Is the intensity of Russia's assault on Ukraine still going to be as tough?
Well, it looks as though the Wagner Group is either going to be pulled out of Ukraine entirely or that efforts will be made to integrate its people within the structures of the Russian regular army. And either way, it doesn't look unproblematic. I think in total, the numbers of Wagner forces deployed there are perhaps not of such a critical dimension that it deals a huge blow to the assets that Russia can deploy on the ground in Ukraine. But it can't be good news in terms of if you're a Russian fighting in Ukraine, you will be hearing a lot about this. No efforts can be successful in keeping this news away from you. And I'm sure that one way or the other, the effect on the morale of Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, as well as to some extent, though I wouldn't exaggerate this, to some extent on their kind of ability to maneuver, their ability to defend positions and so on. I think that part of it, I'm not so convinced that it's a great sort of operational or logistical blow to Russia's deployments in Ukraine. But I think the morale implications, the sense that the leadership in Moscow is wavering and it can be challenged, I think all that could have some quite serious effect on the way in which the Russian armed forces conduct themselves in continuing their war on Ukraine in the future.
Simon, what's really going on here? What did Prigozhin really want to happen? Because, I mean, it seems quite unusual that he has agreed to essentially set up camp in Belarus with whoever else is heading there with him. We haven't heard much of Sergei Shoigu, what's happening in terms of him, whether he's still in post. I mean, I don't actually think we've heard anything from him over the last 24, 48 hours. Is there something more to this than just frustration at the way President Putin has been running things? Because lots of people have suggested huge dark motives behind the scenes. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that to put it at its most simplest, what we're seeing here is a sort of rats fighting in the sack factor. It makes sense sometimes to remember that in many respects, it makes sense to look at the Kremlin as an organized crime group, not as a government. It makes sense certainly to look to some extent at Prigozhin's Wagner people as an organized crime group. And we know that organized crime groups fight each other. They don't only steal from people. They don't only commit crimes, but they fight each other. And I think there is quite a significant rats in the sack factor here. I think Prigozhin made it very clear the depth of his animus against Shoigu, against the Russian chief of staff Gerasimov. And he made it clear that to some extent this was a personal attack on them. In the statements that he was making while he was still being careful not to mention Putin by name, his main focus, Prigozhin's main focus, appears to have been on Shoigu and Gerasimov, and on a pitch to say these guys have got to go because they're making a mess of the war. And in that sense, it was a bit of a power play on his part.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon Smith.
Thank you.